Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our online event today, the Renewal of the Palestinian Movement, a Transnational Unity from Below. In addition to the participants registered in Zoom, I would also like to welcome our guests on Facebook. My name is Magda Seewald, and I'm a project coordinator and gender advisor with a regional focus on the Middle East at the VIDC, the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation. I also welcome, of course, our speakers of today who will join us from different angles of the world. The speakers are Yara Hawari, Ahmed Abu Artema, and Mohammed El-Kurd. Welcome to our discussion today. And welcome also to the moderator, Helmut Krieger, of tonight. I would like to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues from VIDC for their technical support and the Austrian Development Cooperation for its financial support for today's webinar. I want to also point out that our event will be recorded and documented, and the discussion will be streamed live on Facebook. You can ask questions at any time on Zoom in the Q&A sections. My colleague Nathalie Luftensteiner will introduce your questions into the discussion. During and end of the webinar, we will provide you with a link to a feedback form to complete. This will help us to incorporate your suggestions and critique into upcoming events. I would like to draw your attention to VIDC's new podcast, Blickwechsel, der Podcast für einen neuen Blick auf die Welt, the podcast for a new look to the world. You can find the podcast on our website as well as on all usual podcast platforms. Today's webinar is part of our focus on politics in the Middle East and on Palestine in particular. You can find reports and articles on our website, vidc.org. Today, we will shed light on the ongoing Palestinian protests. After decades of fragmentation, geographically, socially, and politically, in recent months we have seen a popular mobilization within all parts of Palestinian society, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Israel, as well as abroad. This new so-called unity intifada shows Palestinians are reclaiming a shared narrative and struggle. I quote here one of our guests tonight, Yara Hawari. In today's webinar, we will take a closer look to this new movement with activists from different segments of Palestinian society. Before giving the floor now to my colleague Helmut Krieger, who is the moderator of today's talk, I would like to introduce him to you. Helmut Krieger is a social scientist, researcher and senior lecturer at the Department of Development Studies at the University of Vienna, as well as a consultant to the VIDC Global Dialogue Department. And he has curated today's webinar. Thank you so much, Helmut, for your great cooperation. And now the floor is yours. I wish us all an interesting evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you really so much, Magda, and for sure for the very professional cooperation we already have for more than, let's say, 10 years, 12 years. And for sure, thanks a lot to the VIDC team for facilitating this discussion round. And for sure, thank you very much, our audience, for joining our online event on the renewal of the Palestinian movement, the transnational unity from below, question mark, wherever you are now. And it's my distinct pleasure to chair this discussion round. We are very, very pleased to welcome Ahmed Abu Artema, Yara Hawari, and Mohammed El-Kurd. So really thanks so much for speaking at our event, for sharing your thoughts with us. First of all, let me very briefly introduce our speakers, and an extended version of the biographies can be found afterwards in the chat. Ahmed Abu Artema is a Palestinian writer and peace activist from Gaza. His family was expelled from their home in the Ramallah district in 1948. He was born then in Rafah in Gaza. He is one of the founders of the Great March of Return, a series of demonstrations held at the Gaza-Israel border since 2018, demanding the right of return. And I will for sure go on, especially about the right of return in a few minutes. So I hope you can still hear me. Really, Ahmed, thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Yara Hawari, Dr. Yara Hawari is the senior analyst of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. And in addition to her academic work, she is a frequent political commentator, writing for various media outlets, including Al Jazeera, English, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. And Mohammed El-Kurd is an internationally touring and award-winning writer and poet from Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. Together with his twin sister, Muna, he has been documenting, speaking, campaigning against the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And for sure, many of you might know the campaign Save Sheikh Jarrah. His work has furthermore been featured in numerous international outlets. So really, thanks again, and great that you can join our webinar. And therefore, I would like to speak just a few words about the format of our online event. But we will have short inputs from all our speakers, let's say for about 50 to 60 minutes, and then we will open the floor with questions and comments. So please use the Q&A section for raising your questions, commenting on the inputs provided by our speakers. So, as Magda already mentioned, our webinar deals with a new stage or phase of political unity, and she already referred to the term unity intifada, a political unity among Palestinian communities in their different localities, currently, as far as I can see, led by grassroots initiatives, particularly over the last month or so. In order to discuss this main topic, I would like to summarize some main developments of the last months. For sure, one of the triggering developments for mass popular mobilizations was Israel's planned expulsion of families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinian neighborhood of Jerusalem, as well as police violence, permanent police violence against worshippers at both the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the main entrance for Palestinians to the old city, Damascus Gate, in mid-May this year. The threat of expulsion, a very, very long experience of many Palestinians in their different localities, this threat of expulsion and the police violence certainly catalyzed the mass popular mobilization, daily protests and sit-ins throughout the city. As a result of the violent repression by the Israeli security forces and their ongoing attempts to ethnically cleanse Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem, in mid-May, Hamas, as well as other factions in Gaza, started to retaliate with rockets targeting Jerusalem. Israel responded with 11 days of heavy bombardment of Gaza, killed 248 Palestinians in these 11 days. Thousands more were injured, and entire residential buildings, including a media tower, were destroyed. Thousands of rockets fired from the Gaza Strip by the military wing of Hamas, as well as other factions in the Gaza Strips, to Israel killed 12 persons and injured several hundreds. What was the very remarkable issue these days was for sure also the grassroots mobilization, which continued throughout the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Israel, and beyond the region as well. Hundreds of thousands went to the streets, demanded, in very general terms, demanded collective rights and, if I may use this term, just peace. In so-called mixed cities in Israel, popular resistance by Palestinian communities in Lit, in Ramallah, Haifa, Jaffa, among others, showed political mobilization far broader than in any prior mobilizations in the last years or last decade or so. These protests in a specific sense, culminated in a large-scale general strike on the 18th of May all across historic Palestine. It paralyzed several sectors of the Israeli economy and resulted in billions of US dollars in economic losses due to the Palestinian workforce in the Israeli economy. So what followed since then was, and still is, a projection of power of the colonial Israeli state and its mechanisms of control, repression and dominance, ranging from mass arrests of thousands of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship to criminalizing, as we could see a few days before, to criminalizing Palestinian human rights NGOs, to continuously violent crackdowns on protests all across Palestine. And at the same time, and that is, I think, quite interesting issue as well, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was, politically spoken at that time, sidelined, and for sure also heavily criticized due to its ongoing security cooperation with the colonial power. For sure, the Israeli reactions on popular Palestinian mobilizations are not surprising at all. These mechanisms of control and dominance, together with the further expansion of settlements, the construction of new ones, show clearly how the colonial power could effectively use the Oslo process for its expansionist strategy. For Palestinians, these mechanisms of control and dominance are decade-long experiences. So these very, very short summary of some of the developments over the last month or so, and for sure our guests will further elaborate on that, will lead us to central questions of today's event. On the one hand, given the mass popular mobilizations of the last months, and indeed for sure also years and decades in that sense, and given what Magda already mentioned, the social, political and economic divisions, and in that sense of fragmentation of the Palestinian society, how can we speak of a renewed Palestinian movement now? How is it based on an accumulation of experiences of the last decade? What does unity include in this process when we speak of a unity intifada? What are further political as well as organizational necessities to strengthen such a unity? And for sure, and it would be great if we would come to this question as well, what role can international solidarity initiatives play in this process? So these are main questions. Hopefully we can deal with most of them. And for sure, in order to be actively involved in our discussion, please use the Q&A section to raise your questions, to comment on the analysis provided by our speakers. So my first question about Palestinian unity and the sense of unity goes to you, Ahmed. So far, I didn't mention the Great March of Return, the series of demonstrations held at the Gaza-Israel border in 2018, 2019, and for sure continuously on some days. Calling, and that was, I think, the essential political point, calling for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. The Israeli forces responded and you can tell us more about that, by shooting tear gas canisters, rubber bullets, live ammunition, mostly by snipers. Killed in these first 2 years of the demonstrations more than 200 Palestinians, and over 36,000 people have been injured, according to UN OCHA statistics. So the Great March of Return has put the Nakba, the flight and expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their home in 1948, back at the center of the antagonism. And I think, from my point of view, this reflects a kind of foundational shift away from the Oslo parameters set up in the 1990s. So, Ahmed, how do you view the experiences of the Great March of Return? How do you view this how do you assess the repercussions the Great March of Return had all over Palestine and beyond? And how did it, and how does it contribute to today's protest movement?
Yes, thank you very much, Helmut, for hosting me, and thanks for you for organizing this event. Yes, the March of Return was a very important station in the Palestinian struggle for freedom and for the return to the refugees. You know, the majority of the Palestinian people are refugees. They were expelled out forcefully from their villages, their homes in 1948. That year, what's called the Nakba, including me personally and my family. We were in a Ramallah village. It's now in what's called now Israel, and we became refugees. This was the price, the human cost of the Israeli, of the establishment of the state of Israel from the first day. So the importance of the March of Return was that it brought the Palestinians back to the root of the problem. You know, in the media, they speak a lot about the settlement, about the state on the border of 1967, prisoners, the siege of Gaza. Yes, all of those are important issues, but the main issue, the root of the problem, is that we are refugees and we want to return to our homes. The beginning was before 2018. The beginning was in 2011, specifically with the beginning of the Arab Spring, after the collapse of the president of Tunisia, then the president of Egypt at that time. We as Palestinian youth, we felt that our spirit is inspired, and we started in our social media asking why not we do it. Some of youth say let us protest against the division, but my group said no, let us return to the root of the problem. The root of the problem, yes, we don't have a regime as Tunisia and Egypt to struggle peacefully against it, but we have our main cause, that we are refugees and we want to return to our home. And I wrote at that time in 2011 an article on websites, and I was surprised that my article was published widely among the Palestinian refugees, not only in Gaza Strip, but in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, West Bank, the occupied Palestine since 1948. And many of the activists started to message me and asked, we want to do something. We want to achieve this this idea. I answered him, it's not, I'm not an organizer, I'm only a writer. And I suggested this idea, but as it touched their hearts, this means that it was very important for them. And yes, it actually happened in May 15, 2011. Tens of thousands of the Palestinian refugees came to the borders to Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, Gaza, West Bank, occupied Palestine 1948. And at that time, the Israeli occupation forces shot them, and tens of the refugees were killed at that day. Yes, this was the first march of return. In 2018, I wrote another Facebook post, specifically on January 7, 2018. I suggested at that post that we are dying slowly inside Gaza, and we have the right. Why not to try to scream, to make our voice heard for the world? And I suggested at that post Great March of Return. So in the coming days, I was surprised again that the hundreds of the Palestinian activists reacted with that call, and they started to say, yeah, let us organize. Let us make this idea, make this dream as reality. So it wasn't only because I wrote that post. It was because of the common feeling, because of the general feeling. They were feeling that this is very important. The alternative of the March of Return in 2018 was that the people in Gaza will die slowly because of the Israeli siege, the Israeli policy of the deprivation, the deprivation against the Palestinian people from all the necessities of the life. So some of people asked me why the Palestinians went to this choice despite the high cost, despite the high victims. My response that it was not our choice. It's not. You cannot blame the victim. It's unfair to blame the victim when he decide to shoot, when he decide to shout, to scream. This is the Palestinians do what the Palestinians did it. So the March of Return was very important. Why? Because it showed a third way for the Palestinians, not only either to go to the military resistance as the movements and factions in Gaza did, or to go to the what the PA do as negotiations and nothing else. The message of the March of Return was we have other choices. We have the choice by our popular power, not only by the power of the parties and factions, but we as Palestinian people, elderly people, youth, women, civil society, all the Palestinian society shared, participated in the March of Return effectively. And that I will tell you about the first day of the March of Return, March 30, 2018. It was amazing scene. More than hundreds of thousands of the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip near the fence of their occupied territories, the towns, the territories that they were expelled out from it in 1948. more than 100,000 of the people, including elderly people. I saw elderly people, they cannot walk, but they came at that day. And because they never forget before that. Yes, it was before 70 years, but they are still remembering that we have the right there. We have the right. It's our right. No one have the right. Neither Israel, neither the international community has the right to cancel this right of us. The people in the refugees are still keeping their keys, the keys of the doors that they were expelled from in 1948. They are still, until now, after 72 years, they are still keeping it. And when they are dying, before they are dying, they give the keys and the papers, the documents for the next generations. This means that, yes, the Palestinians are weak. The Palestinians are still under the Israeli oppression, the Israeli occupation, the Israeli apartheid, but they didn't, and they will not adapt with this reality. They are still resisting. It's not only they are resisting by rockets, by guns, but also they are resisting, but the existence itself. So our existence is resistance. You know, the Israeli vision was based that Palestine is without people, and we are people without home. So Palestine is the home of the Jewish people. But so the Israeli real vision that they want to see zero Palestinians, no Palestinians. They are trying to push us to the same destiny of the native nations and the native people in America and Australia. This is the Israeli strategy. But the Palestinians, by their existence first, and by their resistance by many ways, including the March of Return, including what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, including the protests in West Bank and what's called Israel, the Palestinian 1948, by using those many tools and those many ways, the Palestinian message that we are still here. We are millions today, the millions of Palestinians between the sea and rivers. And this means, yes, Israel has the power, has the economic and military and political support, but they cannot win in the battle of the narrative. They cannot say for the world there is no Palestinian people. And this was the Zionist vision, that there is no Palestinian people. There is Palestinian people. Yes, we are weak, but we trust that the time will change. And one day, as the apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed, as all the peoples around the world who struggled for their freedom, they finally win. And surely, deeply, we trust that one day we will win. And simply because we don't have to do anything but one thing: to get our freedom, to get our dignity, to be free in our land, to travel freely in our land. So our goals are very moral, legitimate. So we trust that we will win and we will prevail.
Thank you. Thank you really so much for your impressive words, Ahmed. And I will use some of them. You talked about dignity, you talked about freedom, and I will use these very fundamental terms in the renewal of a Palestinian movement to ask more or less the same question to you, Mohammed. The Safe Sheikh Jarrah campaign turned out to be a very effective catalyst for mass mobilizations within Palestinian communities in their different localities. Given these experiences over the last month or so, given the experiences Ahmed told us about, how do you view the issue of unity, this sense of unity that could be experienced over the last months or so? What are necessary components from your point of view of such a unity from a political and organizational point of view?
Sure. Thank you first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with Ahmed Artema and Yara Hawari, and it's a pleasure to be engaging in this conversation. I think the question is pretty easy to answer, given that Palestinians for decades have articulated that the issue we are facing, the crime we are facing, is that of settler colonialism, a settler colonial system that allows an apartheid regime to exist, that allows military and necessitates even military rule and police brutality. And it also has been made possible through a long extended period of ethnic cleansing that has been done in an incremental rate across the stretch of 7 decades, if not more, and through various methods. But this ethnic cleansing has been carried out by different vehicles. In the case of Sheikh Jarrah, it's been referred to for decades as a so-called eviction. It's been referred to for decades as a so-called real estate dispute. In other parts of Jerusalem itself, you have neighborhoods like Silwan, where people are facing ethnic cleansing, but officially and in media records, it is referred to as home demolitions because they have not built their permits. And then in other villages like Al-Aisawiyya, you have people's communities' natural growth stunted because they are not only fragmented, but also isolated by a barrier of quote-unquote national parks that really serve to besiege Palestinian communities and isolate them and cut their social and economic ties from one another. I think what happened here and what has established a sense of unity among the articulations made by Palestinians and among the cumulative resistance of Palestinians and Palestinian movements through years and years has been the fact that today, like like before, we've decided to call things out by their names and say that this is ethnic cleansing, and refuse the sanitized language and refuse the sanitized and indirect ways of referencing to this, the exploiting the legal hierarchies, exploiting the Israeli judiciary that was, by the way, built by settlers on top of Palestinian land to serve settlers, to continue expelling Palestinian land and dismantling Palestinian national identity. So today we are saying this is not an eviction case. This is exactly an ethnic forced displacement. You are utilizing exploitative asymmetrical laws to transfer one population from its native inhabitat to another place, much like you have done in 1948 by forcibly expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and destroying hundreds of villages. You are doing this and have continued to do this for decades and decades and decades. When you are breaking and you're authoring this analysis, people then begin to make sense of what is happening to them and relating. We have this umbrella of settler colonialism that really explains all of displacement and dispossession. And if it's not displacement, it is the anxiety of displacement, the anxiety of residency revocation, all of these tools and methods that loom over our heads for our entire lives as Palestinians between the river and to the sea, make sense. And they have made, in no way am I saying this is a new epiphany, for example, but I'm saying the world is finally catching on. In Sheikh Jarrah, for example, you have, as I said, laws that are being exploited, but in other places, like Silwan, you have peoples whose homes are getting demolished under the pretext of building without a permit. Now, for a normal person or an average person who is not politicized, they think, oh, you should have, it's unfortunate that you're losing your home, but you should have followed the rules and you should have gotten a permit. What flies over this person's head is the fact that over 93% of building permit applications submitted by Palestinians get rejected by the Israeli occupation authorities. Meanwhile, settlements are built far and wide on Palestinian land. So these nuances that intentionally get lost in translation when you sanitize what's happening. It's been, I don't think I am the best. I'm probably not the best person to speak about this in um, you know, I know that Yara's family, for example, is only 2 hours away from me in Jerusalem, and Ahmed Aburtima is also not that far away from me in Jerusalem. But our realities for our entire lives have been dramatically different. Not only do we have legal statuses that are distinctly different, we have different abilities. Ahmed cannot leave the Gaza Strip, I think, ever. Meanwhile, I can enter the West Bank, but I don't have citizenship. So these legal statuses differ, and they do serve to create these parallel realities that fragment Palestinian societies, that make us feel like we're not like one another, that make us, it's an active policy of divide and conquer. And today, we were reminded, much like the articulations that were made in 1936, much like the articulations that were made on Land Day in the 60s, much like the articulations that happen whenever the Israeli regime massacres or murders Palestinians that hold Israeli citizenship. We saw this articulation that happened, that we were all Palestinians, and that these colonial borders that serve to divide us, these fabricated geographies, are just cement. It's just bricks and walls, it's just cement. But within our minds, we are all Palestinians, despite this fragmented identity. And despite all of these, as I said, fabricated geographies, despite all of these checkpoints and military barriers and different legal documents and the hurdles that they put in our way, and they tell us you can't go here and you can't go there. All of this today, I think Palestinians were reawakened, and a new generation of Palestinians was reminded of our Palestinianness per se, and that is really inspiring, to see also a strike across colonized Palestine, to see people striking on the 18th of May of last year, striking in Haifa, in Nazareth, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip. You're seeing this national strike that also reminded us of this unity. But we talk about the Intifada or the uprising. I don't think Intifada is the term. I mean, whatever to call it. But I think we talk about this uprising that happened last year, and what got lost in the cracks is the cost, right? So we have established a lot of gains that I think the Palestinian people should be very proud of in the past year, and I think we are like nowhere near our goal of liberation and decolonization and abolition and dignity and justice, but we should keep pushing for it. But while we're celebrating these gains, we must remember that because the Israeli regime was so startled, was so shocked, was so stunned by people with Israeli citizenships engaging in openly anti-colonial protests, was shocked by these articulations that were making their ways into the mainstream media, because the Israeli public was suffering from this radical shift of global opinion. They've engaged in this massive violent crackdown against Palestinian populations, regardless of geography, across colonized Palestine. And today there are Palestinians that are in prison cells, getting prosecuted under the pretext of anti-terrorism legislation, which is characteristically anti-Palestinian and meant to stifle our resistance. All of these things must not be, all of these consequences that are harrowing. The fact that my neighbor, Murad Atiyah, for example, who's a 25-year-old middle school teacher, has gotten arrested and is getting tried for merely defending his home, for merely engaging in sit-ins, for merely chanting against the occupation, against forced ethnic displacement. He's being charged with rioting and anti-police acts and so on and so forth. which is meant to deter him and instill fear in our community, that has been able to catalyze this global support. Now, Murad and 2,000 others like him in Palestine do not have the kind of, are not afforded, are not afforded the kind of visibility that I or other members of our communities are afforded, and so they seem to be forgotten. And I think while we do talk about the diplomatic and political gains we have established, we must not forget the really costly repression that is taking place today. Also it must not. Yeah, I'm sure. Yani, we're all aware in this panel and in the audience. We're all aware of the designation of the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, and these things do serve a very clear do serve a very clear intention of stopping and halting the work of these organizations that do a great work of documenting and exposing Israeli crimes that offer us data and analysis amid this radical global shift in discourse. And yani, it's important to note why this is happening, but it's also important to call out the lack of condemnations. I think yani, the fact that you have a children's defense organization characterized as a terrorist organization, and then you have the U.S. the U.S. administration talking about looking into it with Israeli partners. You have the European Union in Palestine talking about discussing it with their Israeli partners as if it's something to be discussed when it should be completely politically, diplomatically, and culturally rejected and even punished for doing such outrageous methods. So we have these political gains, and then we have these repercussions and these consequences. But I do want to say that although these consequences, this violent crackdown of arbitrary arrest, of torture, we've also heard many accounts of torture. For example, Adala Legal Center, which is based in 1948 occupied Palestinian territory, reported on a torture room in Nazareth. There's a police station in Nazareth in which there was people who were affidavits, people who were arrested, as well as attorneys reported seeing bloody floors because of the beatings, reported horrendous beatings. All of these things that we're hearing about, from the arbitrary arrest to the torture and the beatings, to the psychological torture, to the residency revocations, to more and more, we're hearing more and more demolition orders, and we're seeing more and more people being forced to self-demolish their own homes in comparison to recent years. All of these things, right, they do have the purpose of instilling fear and intimidation and stifling and further fragmenting Palestinian societies. But I do think for Palestinians to be on the other end, on the receiving end of the same gun, be it in Haifa, led Ramallah, or in Jerusalem, or in Ramallah and Bethlehem, or in Gaza, to be on the receiving end of the same tear gas, that reminds us yet again of our Palestinianness. So not only are we all Palestinian and unified in resistance and in uprising, but even in these consequences, in this brutal military rule that we are experiencing, and this arbitrary violent crackdown that we are experiencing, we're also constantly reminded of our Palestinianness. So it's kind of a catch-22 for the Israeli regime, because no matter what they do, this Palestinian spirit of national identity, of this hunger for liberation, has always existed, but has been reignited this summer, and I don't think there's anything they could do to quell it.
Thank you really so much for your very clear and impressive analysis on the situation. To call things out by their names, and a generation permanently reminded of their Palestinianness. Yara, let me bring you into our discussion. What is your understanding of this political development over the last month or so, given the very clear experiences and analysis of Mohammed as well as Ahmed? What do you think about political as well as organizational necessities for the different grassroots initiatives, for the different NGOs, as well as a thriving Palestinian, as well as thriving Palestinian communities in their way of dealing and confronting a settler colonial state. Yara, can you hear me? Yara? Mohammed, you can hear me. Ahmed, you can hear me as well. Yeah. So I think we've lost the connection to Yara. Now it's working again. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
So perhaps I'll just take a moment just to say just a couple of minutes to talk about unity, because I do think it's an important question, and I think the events, and then I will address your question with regards to civil society. But I think the events of the summer were significant for many reasons. You know, as was mentioned previously, you know, Palestinians were referring to what happened as the Unity Intifada meaning uprising in Arabic, and it saw that.
I'm very sorry, we can't hear you anymore, Yara. I think we have a quite bad connection now. I can see all others might have the same problem as I have.
Because of the dispossession and ethnic cleansing that was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, but also because in Sheikh Jarrah they saw their own stories, right? They saw the stories of themselves, of their parents or grandparents, and indeed the Palestinian story is one of constant displacement. And the incredible work of, you know, activists and the grassroots in Jerusalem, including Mohammed, really brought that front and center, and it made it accessible to Palestinians, you know, wherever they were across colonized Palestine and beyond. And so I think it was a turning point. I think the fact that en masse Palestinians were saying, we might live under different manifestations of colonial rule from Haifa to Ramallah to Jerusalem and Gaza. We are still facing the same regime that wants to erase us. And it was difficult for people to fragment us in that moment. You know, the aesthetics were very clear. Here we had tens of thousands of Palestinians marching in the streets of Jerusalem and Haifa, Nazareth, al-Fahm, waving Palestinian flags, chanting Palestinian chants. And it forced the mainstream media to contend with that, you know, that people that they had called Israeli Arabs were very clearly articulating a Palestinian identity. And I actually want to read something out from something that was published at the time of the uprising. It was a manifesto titled "The Dignity and Hope Manifesto of the Unity Intifada," and it was published by activists, and I think it really highlights the unity in the Unity Intifada. So the manifesto reads, "We are one people and one society throughout Palestine. Zionist mobs forcibly displaced most of our people, stole our homes and demolished our villages. Zionism was determined to tear apart those who remained in Palestine, to isolate us in sectional geographical areas and transform us into different and dispersed societies so that each group lives in a separate large prison. This is how Zionism controls us, disperses our political will, and prevents us from a united struggle against a racist settler colonial system throughout Palestine." So, you know, I think that really sums it up. And I do think that this year was a unifying moment. And I don't think it was unprecedented, but I do think that it was certainly something very exceptional, inspiring for younger generations, and especially those who did not live through the first Intifada. But I also want to problematize a bit that this idea of unity. You know, Palestinian society is a plural one in all the senses of the term. You know, we're divided in similar ways that other communities are divided along racial, gendered, class lines. And you know, whilst it's not unique to Palestine, these structures of power are exacerbated by the settler colonial regime we live under. And often Israel plays on those divisions to further divide us. And this is not to mention, the geographic fragmentation, which divides us, that Mohammed also talked about. And so I think this is why Palestinian unity is all that much more harder to achieve. And that's why it's phenomenal when we do achieve it. Now, with regards to your next question, we know, last week, the Israeli regime criminalized 6 Palestinian NGOs, human rights NGOs. And there has been an outpouring of support from the international solidarity scene and various third state actors. But it's important to note that this isn't something new. The Israeli regime has been attacking Palestinian civil society since 1948. This is only an escalation in its project to destroy Palestinian civil society. And it has tried all attempts to do so. It has tried to go after the funders. It has tried to arrest their staff and their directors. It has tried to raid their offices, literally take them offline, freeze their assets, and they haven't been successful in doing that. Palestinian civil society has been steadfast in its resolve to serve the Palestinian people, and so this is another attempt. They just took it up a notch. They want to criminalize Palestinian society, and it's a direct, attempt to scare funders off. It's also to do with assets. This will make it very easy for the Israeli regime to freeze assets. So if it so wants. But as I said, this isn't something new. This has been an ongoing process, and it will be really interesting to see how it plays out in terms of, the manifestations of this criminalization. Because already Israel could arrest whoever they wanted. Already in the West Bank and Gaza, already Israel, can harass and detain. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And as Mohammed said, this is an important moment for the international community. And don't get me wrong, I don't have high expectations, because we Palestinians have learned for decades not to have high expectations from the international community. But this is a moment for the international community to say, enough is enough. You're going after an organization which literally seeks to defend children from military occupation. And one of the oldest human rights organizations, not just in Palestine, but also in the Middle East, Al-Haq, which just so happens to be supplying evidence to the ICC investigation on Israeli war crimes in 2014. And it is not a coincidence that the person who pushed for this criminalization, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz, is probably going to be indicted in that investigation for war crimes.
Yeah, thank you really so much, Yara. And for sure, I'm absolutely aware of the fact that you don't have any kind of idealistic illusions about the international community, especially about the different Western powers and their way of dealing with criminalizing Palestinian human rights NGOs. Nevertheless, for sure, and then I think this is something we will discuss as well, how grassroots initiatives in the West, or better to say all over the world, solidarity initiatives can support or can be part of a process of reconfiguring Palestinian movement. But first of all, let me come back to one of the issues you raised, and let me ask you just a very quick question about the necessity of unity. For sure, an experience of the Palestinian national movement as long as it exists. But nowadays, given the leading role of grassroots initiatives in these last months or so, how can these kinds of leading roles be transformed into a more stable form, politically as well as organizationally?
I think Palestinian history is rich with examples of transforming grassroots power into larger political power. And I say this because I do think it's really important that we draw from these examples and experiences rather than, attempting to reinvent the wheel. For example, if you look at the first intifada of the late 1980s, this was a mass collective grassroots uprising that didn't come from the Palestinian leadership. It actually came from the streets, it came from the communities. And it also wasn't spontaneous, it was the result of years of grassroots organizing, which created the foundation for mass politicization and popular struggle. All these unions, student groups, collectives, political factions, they've actually formed a coalition, and they called it the Unified National Leadership of the Uprising. And they made decisions, and they had a rotating leadership system, which, established this spirit of representation. But it also was very practical because it responded to the frequent arrest of leaders. And the uprising was centered on the notion of people's power as a form of popular and revolutionary consensus. And so this period, I think, demonstrates incredibly well how revolutionary democratic processes and formations of leadership can happen outside of state institutions. And this isn't to romanticize the past. There were still, the spaces were still wrought with power dynamics, very patriarchal spaces. But they were practicing, a form of, transferring a sort of a grassroots movement into one that had leadership potential, and that was a decision-making body. And this is so far from discussions now among Palestinians, and it's so far from our imagination. And I think this is one of the consequences of colonialism, is that it confines our realms of possibility to the boundaries of the colonial state. And Oslo played a big role in that as well. It set this framework of state building and NGOs, etc. And our lexicon has completely changed from what it once was. We talk in a language that is not Palestinian, even when we speak in Arabic. We talk about outcomes and funding, and even we talk about state institutions as if there is a state when there isn't. And all of this really wreaks havoc on our spaces to think politically and to mobilize against the Israeli regime. Essentially, it's led to a process of depoliticization. And I think it's crucial for the Palestinian grassroots, for movements to counter that, to politicize the Palestinian people once more, and to think outside of the box, so to speak, to think beyond the colonial boundaries that not only the Israeli regime has set for us, but unfortunately also the international community.
Thank you so much. Let me bring in again Ahmed as well as Mohammed, the very, very complex and rich history of the Palestinian national movement. And Yara gave a very clear example of what can be adapted, what can be used of this very rich history, the first Intifada, the popular committees, the unified national leadership. What else would you say is necessary in readapting and reorienting of the Palestinian national history? Ahmed, or maybe you'd like to?
Let me speak about our generation, my generations, and the younger generations. We found ourselves in a very difficult separation reality. As Mohammed mentioned, for me personally, I never visited Jerusalem. It's only 1 hour by car from Gaza, but I never visited it. I never visited West Bank. I never visited the occupied Palestine since 1948. So we didn't connect with the people, with our generations from the other communities. My only opportunity was to connect with the Palestinians in the other communities when I left Gaza from Egypt, and I found them in Europe and in the United States, and I told them that it's easier to come to Europe and to meet you than to go to Ramallah and meet you. And this is because of the Israeli deliberate separation between the Palestinians. So what happened in the last May specifically was very important because it reminds the Palestinians that they can be united, that they are united. They are united people despite all the obstacles and the fences and the borders. Yes, we are physically separated, but we have the same soul, we have the same spirit, we have the same cause, the same occupation, the same future, and the same target, that all of us, we want our freedom and our dignity. So this brought us together as Palestinians. And last May, it has very important thing that all the Palestinians in the same time in Gaza and West Bank, Jerusalem, Palestine 1948, and also the Palestinian refugees from Lebanon, from Jordan, they all together engaged in the same battle. And this is very important for us, and this was very dangerous for the Israeli colonialism, because it reminds us. So I think what happened in May, it will form the imagination of the Palestinians, specifically the new generations, and it was the example. I'm sure in the future we will find the same battles, the same unity in our struggle against the Israeli colonialization. And yes, I think there is an important role on the Palestinian leaders and on the Palestinian media and on the Palestinian foundations to strengthen this unity and make more connections, at least by social media ways and technical ways between the Palestinians. As example, Mohammed, if there was no Israeli occupation, I can visit him to Jerusalem and he can come to Gaza. It's very easy. It's only 1 hour or 2 hours by car. But because of the Israeli occupation, maybe some of us spent all his lifetime without visiting the rest of his home, Palestine. So I think there is an important responsibility on the leaders and on the Palestinian factions and on the Palestinian foundations to strengthen this feeling among the Palestinian new generations.
Thank you, Ahmed. So you have already brought in the issue of the different Palestinian leaders. That includes for sure the different Palestinian factions. But first of all, let me ask you, Mohammed, about the experiences of Ahmed. Can you please mute your mic? Thank you. Thank you. Very sorry. We don't have a very stable connection. Mohammed, if we include the experiences of the First Intifada, if we include experiences of the different phases of the Palestinian national movement, in order to recreate, in order to re-strengthen unity, which seems to be an absolutely essential component of every anti-colonial movement, what else would you think about? What else would you integrate from the historical experiences of the Palestinian national movement or other anti-colonial movements all over the 20th century, or I don't know, the revolts in the Arab world that started already in 2011.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think during the first Intifada or the second Intifada, people were clutching their pearls as hard as they do today when they listen to some people speaking about a liberationist struggle like the Palestinian struggle. I think the international community it must now face its obligation to reflect and challenge the way it has responded to the Palestinian resistance movements. It has responded to Palestinian liberation movements across history, but especially in the past 2 decades. This vilification and demonization of the Palestinian, especially the resistant and militant Palestinian, is out of place and and completely out of line, especially when Palestinians are presented with systemic material violence every single day. Today we are in this dichotomy in which I am facing state violence on a systemic level, and so has my father and my grandfather, and so has my co-panelists' families faced for many years. We are facing ethnic cleansing, but yet in the international sphere, in the public sphere, this is presented as a two-sided conflict in which our sentiments and our anger and maybe our hostility and disdain are comparable somehow to a nuclear state, to the only state with nuclear weapons in the Middle East, right? There is this, I want to say delusion. There's this delusion in the way we have narrativized this so-called conflict, that now a Palestinian person who is stateless, who doesn't have political representation, and whose political representation is not only highly influenced by the Israeli occupation, but highly collaborative with the Israeli occupation. And I'm speaking about the Palestinian Authority here, of course. Not only is this the situation, not only are we not institutionally backed, but we are facing this nuclear country with one of the world's most lethal armies occupying our land, destroying our communities in many ways, in a myriad of ways. And yet, in the international sphere, it's considered culturally okay to question Palestinians about their hostility, about their sentiments, about how they feel about their oppressors, about the people who colonized their lands. So today I'm here at the Vienna Institute of Diplomatic. Yeah, I'm here at this forum. I'm very glad to be here because I want to speak to the people listening to us, and I want them to challenge the ways they have been conditioned to respond to Palestinians' people plight for dignity and liberation and justice, and respond to respond to anti-Palestinian racism in your workplaces. The fact that we have to muffle our words and water down our words and go and give 1,000 million disclaimers before we can give a word in is indicative of how far behind the international community is from the Palestinian plight for justice. We talk about the Holocaust and we talk about slavery and we talk about things that have happened in the past, and we talk about them with so much moral clarity today. But when they were happening, that moral clarity on diplomatic political level was not present. So today, the situation that we're facing as Palestinians is not unique in the sense that diplomacy is yet to catch up with the moral clarity that is presented with the Palestinian people, right? Today we're seeing organizations like Beit Salem, we're seeing organizations like Human Rights Watch deliver these miraculous epiphanies that Palestinians have had for decades on end. Sure, good on them. But my question is, why are we putting so much heft and authority on outsider organizations, sometimes organizations that belong to the oppressor, when the Palestinians have made these conclusions starkly clear ever since the start of Israeli settler colonialism on our lands? So today, there is a challenge for Palestinians to mobilize and become unified and create these collective collective working groups and land committees and village committees. But that's our problem and that's our obligation. Your obligation as people in Austria, Germany, wherever in Europe, your obligation is to clear the public stage so that Palestinians can make these iterations, make these articulations without losing their careers, without losing their jobs, without getting dozens of death threats, right? I think there's so much power in organizing locally, and I think that what needs to be done in each city that you're like tapping into us from, listening to us from.
Yeah, thank you really, really so much for this very clear and absolutely convincing statement. And for sure, we have a lot of examples in the way how Palestinian narratives are restricted, contained, and replaced academically, politically, socially, culturally. Just one of these examples you brought over. You already brought up, Ahmed, Nakba, oral history of the Nakba, of all these Palestinians who were confronted with, who survived the Nakba. And the issue of an oral history was totally neglected when the history of Palestine, from the perspective of the hegemonic powers, were rewritten. We have a lot of these, I think, developments, let's call it in this quite neutral term. So we have a lot of clear power asymmetries in our languages. We have a clear responsibility in exactly dealing what happens on the ground. And for sure, this leads me to the questions from our audience as well, because it's already 70 minutes after our starting point. So really, thank you so much, Mohammed. And I would like to include questions from our audience as well now, and hopefully everybody can see them. And please, if you like to raise questions, use the Q&A section, in German, the F and R section. So we just have, I think, as far as I can see, three different ones. I have a question: how is the present situation for Palestinian people with disabilities? A second question, I think we can collect some of them. I have a question to Yara Hawari. In last years, we have seen new feminist Palestinian movements like Talat. Can you tell us more about their activism and role in the broader movement? Another one on how does this new movement relate to large Palestinian mass organizations like Fatah or Hamas? And I think we have another one about the protests beginning in May, if they can be considered as a third intifada. How does this new generation of journalists, activists, artists, and scholars have managed to position Palestinian narratives in mainstream media better than old generations? Do you consider Ghassan Kanafani a martyr? So I don't know why the last sentence, but what I think what you have already absolutely made clear, Mohammed, is the way how to speak creates realities, and the way how to speak truth to power creates a space of new possibilities. So we have a lot of questions. Yara, do you want to answer the question directed to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Well, the question was in reference to this new Palestinian feminist movement called Talat, which was established in late 2019. And it was really the first time in sort of more recent history that Palestinian women took mass action under this very explicitly political and feminist banner, and it succeeded in mobilizing Palestinians across colonized Palestine, and they mobilized under the slogan, "There is no free homeland without free women." And at the time, it was very much fetishized by the West as this sort of movement against, honor killings, that finally Palestinian women had, woken up, or but it was a very there was a very big misreading of what the movement was by a lot of commentators and researchers. The movement was and is a feminist movement that is deeply political and considers gendered violence and gendered oppression as part and parcel of the Palestinian struggle. And so indeed, the movement was did come out of a string of killings of women. That was one of the reasons why women mobilized at that point in time. But the language and the political narrative of Tal'at is deeply anti-colonial, is deeply revolutionary, and it follows a very revolutionary feminist tradition, where we see oppression as systematic and rooted in all these different structures of power, race, capitalism, gender oppression, etc. So this was really something that was quite unprecedented in recent times. And the thing about Tal'at is that these are women that are already part of many different movements on the streets. These are not, new women that have come out of nowhere. These are women that are very much involved in Palestinian civil society, in the Palestinian grassroots, coming together under this particular banner. And I don't know what the second part of the question was, but I hope that answered the interest about that. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think definitely that was a really wonderful answer. Just a very quick question to that. How do you understand this kind of trying to co-opt even radical feminist movement by international donors, by international?
Well, funnily enough, I mean, the movement was inundated within 2 weeks of the first demonstration and it's like launching. It was inundated with requests from white researchers, from donors, from all these different groups who have for so long fetishized Palestinian women. And they didn't really grasp what the movement was about, that actually it rejects, the orientalization of Palestinian women. It rejects the NGOization of the Palestinian grassroots. And so I think that slowly became clear as the movement progressed. But unfortunately, we're always going to see that where, Palestinian women are orientalized and fetishized in this way, and not just Palestinian women across this region. When they are doing something overtly political, it's always considered as, something phenomenal and exceptional. And that does such a disservice to Palestinian women, to Arab women who have been at the forefront of political struggles for decades and have always been present and have always led the way and have always carried the heaviest of burdens in these struggles and have never been given the credit for it. And so when they fetishize movements like this, it is completely dismissing history, which tells a very different story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Can we deal with this question about certain Fatah, especially about how does this new generation? And I'm reading now the question from our audience. How does these new generations of journalists, activists, artists, and scholars have managed to position Palestinian narratives in mainstream media better than the old one? I don't know if you like to answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it, on my personal responsibility. It's hard because I don't think this is an epiphanous generation that's reaching these prophetic conclusions. I don't think that's the case whatsoever. All of the articulations and the conclusions that I know, I was taught by the generations before me, and I was also taught by the material reality, right? By the bruises that we see on our skin, by the rubble that we see resulting from from our homes being demolished or bombarded. These articulations. It's really hard not to have them when you see the material evidence of settler colonialism on your land. I do think in my personal case, I'm not speaking about everybody, but in my personal case, I do think I dealt with this kind of, you're a Palestinian, you're writing in English, and then you get to the gatekeeping of an editor. The editor who's largely informed by Zionism, who has Zionists in their ear, the editor that might possibly be Zionist, the editor whose like logic and perception of the Palestinian question is largely informed by logical fallacies, by distractions to the main argument, and so you're forced to water this down. I think this summer we've seen Palestinians pushing against these editors and pushing against these TV pundits and pushing against this idea that any platform is a good platform. No, I'm going to come on your platform, but if you're going to be historically inconsistent or if you're going to be politically inaccurate, I am going to correct you. And in that correction, you create a power dynamic in which you become more compelling and more convincing to the viewer at home. And I think that is the distinction. But I don't think at all that we have, on our hands a new generation that's maybe I just don't think, because I am of this new generation, I don't think it's very credible for me to be like, yes, this new generation is better or different than the last generation. I don't think that's a credible remark to make coming from me, but I do think we are facing the same challenges, just approaching these challenges differently. And these iterations that we have had across the stretch of our entire Nakba, our entire dispossession, are largely the same, because the processes that we're dealing with are largely the same. We are just dealing with this gatekeeping, and we're bypassing this gatekeeping very differently. And also, I think social media as a vehicle has allowed a certain kind of pressure on the news cycle. You have kind of forced your way into the news cycle algorithmically by way of making noise and creating noise around the crisis that has been historically ignored by the media, right? Like somebody losing their home in Jerusalem has always been business as usual until we decided it's not. I say that, but I don't want to sound all flowery and romantic. Obviously, our presence on social media, and perhaps Yara could speak more about this, but our presence on social media has been largely targeted since May. I know this personally because my account is registered as a hate account on Instagram, for example. I can't share links. People don't get to see my stories that often. All of these things. So there is this wave of technological silencing of Palestinians on the part of Facebook and Twitter. But also, I think this new generation has been able to largely bypass this gatekeeping. I don't know if it's sustainable, and I don't know what tools or what kind of policy and legislation they're going to create to silence us further, because usually that's the case. You have an uprising, and then you have 1,000 more barriers erected after the uprising to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, and as far as I can see, the different experiences of people fighting for their rights, the way how to innovatively bypass the different blockades and virtual sieges is quite extraordinary. Let me bring in some more questions, and I have to summarize some of them because we are nearly already running out of time. A lot of questions.
I would say that there are a lot of questions about support and solidarity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think in the last few minutes it would be good to talk about that.
Yes. I think that is an absolutely great idea, and I think given the very clear and impressive words from Mohammed, there are a lot of questions now about what can be done in supporting a Palestinian struggle. The one from Sabrina, how can we support the mentioned 6 organizations additionally to Day of Action, such as Stand With Me on social media? What would you recommend to the civil society in Europe to do? How to mobilize the civil society as an individual? What is the single most important thing that we in Europe can do now for the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause? Yes, so we have a lot of questions about the issue of what to do now, and direct it to you. So yes, please, Ahmed, do you like to start? And maybe we will find a way for a final discussion round as well.
Yeah, I hope my voice is clear because there is some crowding in the street. But anyway, I would like to speak about the support from the solidarity movement across the world. Yes, sure. Palestine is the Palestine. It's not only for the Palestinians. Palestine means the battle, the struggle for freedom, and the battle for a world without apartheid, without discrimination. So this is an important battle for everyone. I trust in BDS as an effective way this time, and it's very legitimate, very peaceful, and we should struggle to stop the attempts to criminalize BDS. BDS is it's based on the international law, and it's very effective way to end the Israeli apartheid. So I hope more and more support from the civil society, from the activists across the world to BDS, and to boycott the Israeli apartheid regime. Also, to build more bridges with the Palestinians between the walls, as the Palestinians in Gaza, as example. The Palestinians in Gaza, I would like to speak about my personal experience inside Gaza. I never visited West Bank nor Jerusalem, as I mentioned before. As example, inside Gaza Strip, the majority of the people, specifically the new generations, they never saw any person from outside of Palestine, from outside of Gaza. They never connect with the war. So this make walls, not only the Israeli separation walls, but all the psychological walls. So I think one of the ways of the support of the Palestinians to try to come to Gaza, to try to break this illegal and siege, and to as the March of Return tried to break the wall from inside Gaza, we need to from the activists to try to break the wall from outside of Gaza. I don't mean only the physical wall, but also the political wall and the psychological wall. And again, I deeply believe in the boycott against the Israeli regime in this stage.
So I have to unmute my mic. Thank you really so much, Ahmed. May I ask you, Mohammed, do you want to comment on the issue of support and the necessities, the most important tasks for different solidarity initiatives?
Sure. I think Ahmed did an amazing job illustrating what I would have said. And alternatively, I could say, in addition to everything vital that Ahmed has recommended, um, I think it's like, to me, it's really hard. And I'm in my early 20s, and it's very hard for me to grapple with the idea that there are people in a besieged territory, like 2 million people in a besieged territory, and then that becomes a matter of discussion, a disputed matter. So I think a way of beyond the material support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I think it's really important to work on creating a moment in history where it becomes culturally unacceptable to raise questions about the legitimacy of Palestinian resistance, to raise questions about or interrogate Palestinian people's hostility or disdain for their oppressors. But these things are necessitated alongside the diplomatic and political shifts. We also need to be working culturally, because Palestinians culturally have been assassinated largely and isolated from the public sphere. So it is our obligation to face delusion with rejection. It is obligation to face Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism with condemnation and rejection. It's not something that we validate and took into consideration and say, but yeah, I understand, but on the other side, no. What's happening here is there's a population that has been subjugated for decades and decades on end, many of whom are in an open air prison, many of whom cannot go and live and experience life, cannot have academic, economical prospects the way a normal person should. And that within itself is outrageous and urgent and must end now. And the fact that that's not the public narrative of this so-called conflict is completely insane to me, and it needs to be reversed.
Thank you. Yara, do you like to comment on necessary tasks?
Yeah, maybe I would just. Yeah, maybe I'll just say a few words. I think our international allies are lucky in the sense that there are very clear guidelines that have been set out by Palestinian civil society, as manifested in the BDS struggle, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. What it does is it calls for international allies to put pressure on their governments to also boycott complicit companies and institutions until the Israeli regime ends the violation of Palestinian fundamental rights. And not only are there guidelines, there's also a whole bunch of tools and tactics that have been developed by Palestinians themselves. And so international allies are quite lucky in this regard. And I think it's crucial that they allow or they give space for Palestinians to take lead and to follow. And I would also say that I think sometimes international allies can feel distant or overwhelmed, or not know if what they're doing is actually helping. And to that, I would say that local politics is very important to the Palestinian struggle. Palestine doesn't exist in a void. Palestine is not, this is not happening on another planet. It's very much part of the global system. It's one example where settler colonialism, racial capitalism, imperial interests meet and manifest in this very ugly form of oppression. And so changing your local politics so that you have progressive policymakers representing you is actually very key for Palestinians. We know that Israel is supported by the largest powers in the world, and it's very convenient for them to have this imperial outpost such as Israel in what they consider as this hostile Middle East. So for Palestinian liberation to be actualized, it requires a larger global political shift. And this is where I see, allies really taking a major role.
Thank you so much, Yara, for this very clear and I would say impressive statement about the necessities for the different solidarity initiatives in the different parts of the world, for sure, also in Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, wherever. I think, unfortunately, we are already running out of time, and in that sense, I think it was a quite clear and quite wonderful last statement by Yara. Thanks so much, Ahmed, Mohammed, Yara, for your really absolutely clear, sharp, and impressive analysis on the situation, as well as on the necessities that have to be realized. So thank you to all our audience. Thanks so much for joining our webinar. And I'm very, very sorry that we couldn't include all your questions, but I hope that at least the ones we could include in our discussions are some you are also quite interested in to listen to. So thanks again, and I think in the chat, VIDC has already published its next events, or at least the option to further listen listen once again to this